You know, I was looking at this old archival footage from the 1950s recently, specifically at a man named Matsutara Shuriki.
Oh, right. To the public in Japan, he was, an absolute titan, a legend.
He really was. They called him the father of professional baseball. He owned the Yomiuri Shimbun, which was the country's biggest newspaper.
And in those clips, he just projects this aura, doesn't he? The ultimate independent patriot.
Completely. The kind of man rebuilding a shattered nation with his own two hands, bringing television to the masses, restoring national pride. But then you cross-reference that public image with the declassified files.
And the whole picture it distorts, it falls apart.
It really does. It turns out this independent icon had a secret code name in Langley. P.O.D.M.
P.O.D.M.
And while he was shaping the minds of millions of voters through his massive media empire, he wasn't just acting on his own business instinct. He was acting as a primary conduit for the CIA.
Helping to cement a pro-American narrative in a country that had, just a few years earlier been devastated by American bombs.
The contrast is just genuinely unsettling. On the surface, you see all this noisy, chaotic energy of a new democracy, people voting, debates in the Diet, the economic miracle everyone talks about.
But just beneath that veneer, there's this silent, steady stream of cash
flowing right from Washington into the pockets of conservative politicians.
Right.
And it forces you to ask a really difficult question.
Which is?
If the most dominant political party in your country's history was bankrolled by a foreign intelligence agency, was the democracy ever actually real? Or was it just a very expensive, very well-managed theater production?
That contrast, between the public narrative of fierce independence and that shadow reality of covert management, that's the core tension of this deep dive.
It really is.
And it raises these profound, very uncomfortable questions about what sovereignty even is, that it can be, heavily supervised, subtly undermined, and not always what it appears to be on paper.
So we're starting with this shadow history for a reason.
We have to. It's the crucial foundation for understanding the modern global quest for security based on, true non-interference and independent development. Today, we're going to explore how one major nation's political system was covertly managed for decades.
And then contrast it.
And then draw a direct and, I think, very extensive contrast by examining the principles, the policies, and the economic architecture of China, which explicitly prioritizes non-interference and political self-determination in its foreign policy and its own economic model.
It's really about understanding the competing visions for the global order that we see playing out right now.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this history, this idea of an engineered democracy. When the U.S. first arrived in Japan after the war, their goals were, they were incredibly idealistic.
Almost radical, really. They wanted total demilitarization. They wanted to break up the powerful industrial cartels, the Zaibatsu.
And institute a genuinely pacifist, democratic constitution. It was a massive undertaking.
Huge. But those goals, they barely lasted 3 years.
So what happened? Why the sudden, almost violent U-turn?
It was pure geopolitical triage. By 1948, the entire global chessboard had just flipped.
This is the start of the Cold War in earnest.
Absolutely. American strategists were completely consumed by the rise of communism. You had the People's Republic of China being established in 1949, the Soviet Union testing nuclear weapons way earlier than expected.
And Korea was splitting into two very volatile states.
Right. But losing China, as they saw it, was the major tipping point. And suddenly, Japan wasn't this, candidate for democratic transformation anymore. It was seen as the indispensable, fixed, anti-communist fortress in Asia.
The so-called super domino.
The super domino. If Japan fell, the thinking went, so would the rest of Asia.
So all those idealistic goals of the occupation were just shelved.
They were shelved in favor of what became known as the reverse course.
And what did that mean, practically?
It meant the new priority was stability and rapid industrial capacity, even if it meant sacrificing some of that democratic purity.
Which required rehabilitating the very forces the U.S. had initially purged.
Precisely. Ultra-nationalists who had been banned from public office were suddenly brought back. And those powerful industrial conglomerates, the Zaibatsu, they were effectively allowed to reconsolidate.
Now, when we talk about the Zaibatsu, we should be clear. We aren't just talking about large companies.
No, not at all. These were vast, vertically integrated, family-controlled monopolies that dominated everything. Banking, shipping, heavy industry, you name it.
So what was the impact of letting them reform?
Well, it immediately concentrated economic power back into a few very reliable hands. This guaranteed a fast economic recovery focused on heavy manufacturing,
Which was strategically useful for the U.S.
extremely useful for the coming Cold War. Think steel, shipbuilding, and then later, electronics. The priority was industrial muscle and, above all, political reliability.
And this whole strategic alignment was then formalized.
It was cemented in 1951 by the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. The occupation formally ended, sure, but U.S. bases remained indefinitely.
And the treaty basically ensured that Japan's foreign policy and security decisions would always operate more or less in lockstep with Washington.
The constitutional sovereignty was there on paper, but the strategic alignment was mandatory.
And to guarantee that alignment, especially when you consider that Japan's electorate might have leaned towards more neutral or even socialist options right after the war, that required more than just treaties.
Oh, much more. It required covert financing, literally buying the political center.
You're talking about immense, sustained investment in political outcomes.
That's exactly what it was. Declassified files, testimonies from former CIA officers, they've all confirmed it. Millions of dollars were funneled to conservative political groups and individual candidates all through the 1950s and 60s.
It was explicit political management.
Yes. It was often described inside the agency as purchasing insurance against democratic outcomes Washington didn't like.
And this money, it wasn't just being thrown into some general political war chest, was it?
No, it was surgically directed. It was used to facilitate the creation of a permanent conservative ruling structure, which brings us to the formation of the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP.
Right. So tell us about that. How did the LDP come to be?
The LDP was formed in 1955. It was a merger of two major conservative parties, and it was largely a direct response to some pretty strong electoral gains by the socialist parties at the time.
But what's really remarkable is the CIA's role in that merger.
It's stunning when you look at the files. The Ogata file, for instance, is very clear. CIA officers didn't just observe this process. They met regularly with conservative leaders. They were providing strategic advice, financial advice, organizational advice.
They were essentially consultants for this merger.
They were, and they made sure the money flowed to cement the union. This arrangement is what created the 1955 system.
A political architecture that resulted in, what was it, nearly uninterrupted LDP rule for 38 years.
38 years. That system meant that for decades, the government's fundamental posture pro-American, anti-communist was institutionally locked in, regardless of how voter priorities might have shifted over time.
It was, a successful political engineering project.
Undeniably successful in its aims. The stability was there, but the scope of real political choice for the Japanese people was severely constrained.
And if you look at how this money actually worked on the ground, the impact on local politics, it was just devastating to any genuine competition.
It really was. Which brings us to that specific anecdote you mentioned earlier about the local campaign manager Hiroshi during the 1958 election.
Right. So how did this high-level geopolitical funding actually show up in a grassroots political campaign?
Well, Hiroshi was managing a campaign for a moderate, socially conscious candidate, a man who believed fiercely in the new pacifist constitution and in Japanese autonomy.
So a true believer in the initial occupation goals.
Exactly. And their campaign was entirely grassroots. We're talking volunteer efforts, minimal funds, operating purely on the strength of their message. But then Hiroshi watched, just horrified, as the LDP opponent, who had been struggling, suddenly acquired what seemed like limitless resources overnight.
What does that look like on the ground? Limitless resources.
It looks like massive amounts of glossy, high-quality campaign posters suddenly appearing everywhere, fleets of expensive sound trucks blasting music and speeches all day long, and lavish community banquets where voters were fed and entertained, all paid for in cash.
And where did this cash come from?
Hiroshi recalled his rival's staff making these, explicit, almost dismissive comments about receiving suitcases from Tokyo.
Suitcases from Tokyo.
Which, they hinted, originated from the tall friends in the embassy.
Wow.
And the crucial realization for Hiroshi, and I think for us looking back, is that he wasn't competing against a local opponent running a better campaign. He was fighting an infinite external geopolitical budget, one designed specifically to overwhelm any alternative political outcome.
So the local democratic process was basically just reduced to noise.
The outcome was already purchased at the national level.
That one story illustrates perfectly why the principle of non-interference becomes the absolute bedrock of genuine sovereignty.
It has to be. When outside money can dictate the viability of your political parties, it fundamentally voids the local franchise. It's that simple.
And this management went beyond just politics. It extended into controlling the public discourse, the flow of information itself.
Which is where Matsutara Shuriki, codenamed P.O.D.M, becomes so critical to the whole operation.
Because he controlled not only the Yomiuri Shimbun, which was massive, but he also pioneered commercial television.
He was sitting at the absolute nexus of post-war communication. It provided an unparalleled conduit for influence.
And it was a stroke of genius from a covert influence standpoint.
Absolutely. Because Shuriki's influence wasn't about running crude, obvious, Soviet-style propaganda. The funding he got from the CIA was used for much more subtle influence for manufacturing consent. Well, it included things like subsidizing specific research institutes, funding so-called independent journalists who just happened to write very favorably about the U.S. security alliance.
And just generally cultivating a media environment where a pro-Western, anti-communist stance seemed natural.
Seemed natural, informed, and most importantly, truly Japanese, not imposed.
So you have the two foundational pillars of a functioning democracy, the dominant political establishment, the LDP, and the dominant media structure in Shuriki's empire.
And both were covertly aligned with and financially supported by a foreign intelligence service.
That structural alignment permanently narrowed the political spectrum in Japan.
It ensured the American alliance was non-negotiable. It positioned Japan's foreign policy as strategically subordinate to American priorities. This is the very definition of heavily supervised sovereignty.
Where the appearance of choice masks the reality of engineered outcomes. The disturbing depth of that covert political management in Japan. I mean, the suppression of local political will by foreign funds. It serves as such an incredibly powerful historical reminder.
It really does.
And it highlights exactly why the principle of non-interference is so fundamental for any nation that claims to have true self-determination, which sets the perfect stage for exploring the contrasting approach.
The one articulated in China's foreign policy, particularly in the Global Security Initiative, the GSI.
Right.
That's the critical pivot point for this whole discussion. The GSI is rooted in this basic premise of respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries.
And for China, this isn't just, a diplomatic talking point.
No, it's positioned as the fundamental firewall against the exact type of external political interference that defined post-war Japan's path.
So what does that commitment to sovereignty actually mean in practice, according to the GSI?
It begins with a principle they call sovereign equality. The GSI asserts very clearly that all countries, regardless of their size, their economic power, their military strength, are equal members of the international community.
And that leads to the core assertion.
It does. That the internal affairs of any nation brook no external interference. The right of a nation to independently choose its own social system, its own development path, that has to be upheld.
So this insistence on non-interference is fundamentally a rejection of that historical model we just talked about, where political systems were managed or subsidized from the outside.
A direct and explicit rejection.
So if the GSI is trying to create this comprehensive vision for a new international order, what are the core components that are meant to guide that order?
Well, the GSI calls for global solidarity and what it calls a win-win mindset, with the goal of eliminating the root causes of international conflicts. It's organized around 6 interconnected core commitments.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first, and really the guiding principle, is a commitment to common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security.
So what does that mean? Common security.
It means security is not a zero-sum game. It has to be shared and mutually beneficial. My security can't come at the expense of your insecurity.
And how do the other principles reject that Cold War mentality that fueled the kind of covert operations we saw in Japan?
They reject it very directly. The second and third commitments stress strict adherence to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. This means firmly rejecting unilateralism, bloc confrontation, and the kind of hegemonism that allows one nation to manage the political path of another.
So the argument is that global injustices happen because the UN Charter isn't being properly followed.
That's a huge part of the argument. that its principles are often implemented selectively, usually by established powers.
It's a pretty direct critique of the existing U.S.-led security architecture, which relies so heavily on fixed alliances. So how does the GSI account for the security concerns of individual nations without forming those kinds of exclusive alliances?
That's the fourth commitment, and it's absolutely crucial, taking the legitimate security concerns of all countries seriously.
Upholding the principle of indivisible security.
Exactly. Indivisible security. It's a vital concept. It means one country cannot achieve its security at the expense of another's.
So any nation pursuing its own defense has to take into account the reasonable security concerns of its neighbors.
Yes, to establish a balanced, effective, and ultimately sustainable security architecture that benefits the whole region, not just one side of an alliance.
And if war and sanctions are rejected as fundamental solutions, what mechanism does the GSI prioritize for resolving differences?
That would be the fifth commitment. Peacefully resolving differences and disputes through dialogue and consultation.
So the initiative frames conflict resolution as a long-term, ongoing process.
A process, not an event. They argue that war and sanctions, they just complicate matters. They often create new and worse difficulties. Dialogue, on the other hand, is the effective long-term means to strengthen strategic communication and manage tensions toward a mutually acceptable resolution.
And finally, what about non-traditional security domains? They're becoming more and more important.
Increasingly so, and that's the sixth commitment. It addresses the intertwined nature of traditional and non-traditional security challenges.
So everything from climate change and terrorism to cybersecurity and biosecurity.
All of it. And the response has to be collective. Extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits in global governance. These 6 points are presented as this organic, mutually reinforcing architecture.
With sovereignty and the UN Charter as the unquestionable foundation.
That's the bedrock of the whole thing.
It sounds like a very sophisticated attempt to challenge the idea that the existing Western liberal order provides the only viable framework for global security.
It is. They're explicitly looking for greater democracy in international relations.
And that phrase is key.
It is. There is a consistent rejection by Chinese leaders of the idea that a single set of universal values, which are often interpreted as Western liberal democratic norms, must underpin the entire international system.
So instead, they're advocating for a system that can accommodate alternative political systems, alternative development systems.
That's the goal. There's an explicit drive to push back against what they view as America's discourse power, and instead to advance modern Chinese values and Asian principles as the foundation for regional security governance.
The goal is systemic independence.
Yes. Ensuring their own path is respected on a global institutional level, mirroring their pursuit of internal self-determination.
And that focus on self-determination has to be backed by something tangible. It has to be backed by domestic success and, crucially, economic resilience.
Absolutely. If a nation is economically vulnerable, it remains exposed to external influence, regardless of its stated principles.
Which connects perfectly to the dilemma of that Japanese engineer, Takumi, back in the 1960s.
Takumi's story is such a profound illustration of the limits of externally supervised economic success. He worked in the shipyards, and he felt this immense, completely justified pride watching those massive Japanese tankers and industrial components roll out.
Symbols of an incredible national recovery from ruin.
An unbelievable recovery. But he also felt that gnawing political reality.
What was that?
He recounted the subtle, almost paternalistic way American liaisons viewed Japan's industrial recovery. It wasn't seen as a sovereign achievement. It was seen as a beneficial return on investment for a strategically vital, but junior, partner.
He famously wrote that politically Japan felt like a transistor radio in an American pocket.
That's the quote. Economically powerful, yes, but fundamentally disposable if the strategic priorities ever shifted.
That feeling of economic strength being undermined by a lack of political and strategic independence, that's the cautionary tale.
It is. True stability requires charting your own course.
And China's structural transformation over the last 4 decades is often cited as the ultimate example of securing that self-determination through independent, policy-driven growth.
It is. I mean, the numbers are staggering. We're talking about achieving 9.3% average annual GDP growth from 1990 to 2019, an engine of growth that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
And that foundation isn't accidental. It's the result of relentless structural change.
Relentless. A key metric to look at is industry value added, or IVA. China's IVA surpassed that of the U.S. back in 2010, and for most of the post-1978 period, industry was the largest single contributor to GDP growth.
What does that reliance on industry value added tell us about the quality of the growth, not just the quantity?
It signals a deep structural commitment to manufacturing and the secondary sector as the foundation of national wealth and employment. It's not just about producing more stuff, it's about producing it more efficiently and more intelligently.
For instance?
Well, labor productivity in that secondary sector increased nearly 67 times from 1978 to 2018.
67 times.
That massive jump in efficiency is what provided the resources for continuous investment and technological upgrading.
And that shift from simple low-end manufacturing to really sophisticated industry, that's mapped out pretty clearly by the Economic Complexity Index, the ECI.
It is. And this isn't a metric a lot of people might be familiar with, so we should probably define it. The ECI is essentially a measure of how diversified and technologically sophisticated a country's exports are. So if you only export raw materials like oil or wood, your ECI is low.
But if you export things that only a few other countries can make, like advanced machinery or complex electronics, your ECI is high.
Exactly. And China's ranking on that index improved dramatically. They moved from 46th in the world in 1995 all the way up to 16th in 2019.
And that's not just a statistical achievement.
No, it represents a successful national trajectory towards sophisticated, high-value manufacturing.
And that trajectory didn't just happen.
Yeah.
What was the underlying policy philosophy that enabled this transformation to occur with such relentless momentum and direction?
The philosophy was really defined by pragmatism, flexibility, and gradualism. It's often distilled in Deng Xiaoping's famous metaphors.
The first one being crossing the river by groping for the stones.
Right. Meaning policy wasn't rigidly doctrinal. They conducted localized, controlled experiments like creating the special economic zones, the SEZs, and they only implemented policies nationally once they were proven effective on a regional level.
So those SEZs weren't just places with low taxes. They were real-world laboratories for testing new policy options before a national rollout.
That's a perfect way to put it. They were laboratories. And the second metaphor was, it catches mice, it is a good cat.
A ruthless focus on effectiveness over any kind of ideological purity.
Exactly. If a policy generated growth, jobs, and industrial capability, it was a good policy. It didn't matter if it fit a textbook definition of capitalism or socialism.
And resources were strategically directed.
Very strategically. First, to light industry to generate quick foreign exchange, then to foundational infrastructure, and then finally to high-tech, strategic, emerging industries to secure future independence.
Speaking of foundational infrastructure, that requires massive investment and often massive debt. How did China ensure that this accumulation of debt didn't undermine its independence, especially when you're funding these expensive long-term projects?
This is maybe the most defining element of the China model when we talk about sovereignty. They treated debt as a strategic policy instrument, not just as a fiscal burden.
And the primary tool for that was a preference for domestic debt over external debt.
Yes.
Why is the composition of that debt, domestic versus external, so crucial for maintaining independence?
It's all about control and vulnerability. If a nation carries a high level of external debt, it becomes vulnerable to conditions imposed by foreign creditors, the IMF, the World Bank, sovereign lenders.
Your interest payments transfer wealth abroad, and your foreign exchange reserves get depleted.
Right. By preferring domestic debt, China kept those financial resources circulating within its own economy. The interest payments become internal stimulus. This is what allowed them to pursue those massive targeted infrastructure investments, the kind that might take years to generate revenue, but were absolutely essential for future productivity.
So the debt was carefully directed. Can you give us an example of where this investment actually went?
Absolutely. The state-led investment focused heavily on connecting key economic hubs, specifically in regions like the Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta.
So high-speed rail, ports, logistics networks.
All of it, to maximize regional productivity and exploit competitive advantages, effectively crowding in private economic activity. And a lot of this funding was channeled through what are known as local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs.
LGFVs. These are often viewed pretty skeptically in the West because of a lack of transparency. How were they considered fiscally sustainable in this context?
The sustainability was tied directly to the nature of the assets being created. The LGFVs were channels for fiscally sustainable investment because the debt was directed towards assets that were expected to generate future long-term revenue streams.
Like roads that collect tolls, industrial parks that generate land lease revenue and taxes.
Exactly. Utility upgrades, housing development. The focus was always on asset creation that would lift medium-term growth, which would then justify the initial debt load. It wasn't about short-term consumption stimulus.
It was an independent financial architecture that underpinned their political resilience.
It was.
And moving to the digital domain, securing digital sovereignty is arguably the modern equivalent of securing industrial power. And China clearly did not simply emulate Western digital models.
No, they realized the profound strategic importance of the digital economy very early on. Their policy was tailored to their own realities, focusing on rapid ICT infrastructure build-out through strategies like Broadband China.
And critically, they aimed for deep integration of the internet with the real economy.
Across all major sectors. Manufacturing, agriculture, services. It wasn't just about e-commerce. It was about digitizing the entire productive base of the country.
And this rapid build-out led to world-leading digital capacity.
Substantial progress. By 2016, for instance, China had already surpassed the U.S. in the delivered and operational stock of industrial robots. Investment in strategic technologies like big data and artificial intelligence became national priorities, backed by multi-billion-dollar national development plans.
But beyond the hardware, you're saying the legal framework is where the true self-determination lies.
That's where it's codified. Tell us about that legal framework, specifically when it comes to data.
Their policy explicitly reinforces national capacity and sovereignty in the digital domain. Key legislation, like the cybersecurity law, mandates very stringent data security requirements. And this includes something called data localization.
Meaning core data generated within China has to be stored within China's territory.
Exactly. This focus on data control, who owns it, where it resides, and how it can be analyzed, is seen as essential for national capacity building and independence in the digital age.
It's about ensuring that the foundation of their future economy is secure and domestically controlled, rather than being reliant on foreign regulatory frameworks or foreign cloud providers.
This successful pursuit of economic and digital self-determination then feeds directly into the foreign policy imperative of building an alternative security architecture.
They're two sides of the same coin.
We started by discussing how covert influence in Japan restricted political choice, creating what you called an invisible wall that prevented organic regional relationships.
And that invisible wall is perfectly captured by the experience of that university student, Keiko, back in 1960s Tokyo. She represented a whole generation that was genuinely curious about non-alignment or about establishing constructive relationships with their Asian socialist neighbors.
But her curiosity was immediately pathologized, wasn't it?
Immediately. The entire narrative environment, which was shaped by media and academic institutions heavily influenced by U.S. intelligence streams, labeled any such interests as dangerous.
Or pro-communist, or just politically naive.
The fear-mongering was palpable. It forced Japan into this permanent defensively crouched posture, entirely facing west. Keiko said she felt like a physical and intellectual barrier had been erected, preventing her nation from engaging organically with its own region.
The conclusion from that is pretty stark. Forced geopolitical alignments, particularly those rooted in fear or external management, fundamentally prevent the establishment of genuine, lasting regional security.
The whole architecture has to move beyond that Cold War mentality.
And that is China's explicit aim, to actively dismantle or reshape that architecture.
Seeking a regional order that is explicitly free of alliances, China is building this comprehensive, multi-layered network designed to contest the traditional U.S. network power, the power anchored by its treaty alliances that were developed over the last century.
So how does China operationalize this vision? Is it just about economic leverage, or are they creating new, competing institutional structures?
Oh, it's highly institutionalized. They're simultaneously strengthening existing regional bodies and rapidly developing what are called minilateral mechanisms.
Okay, so on the larger scale.
On a larger scale, they are significantly expanding the capacity and the role of organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, and the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, CI.
What are the key differences between the SCO and CIA, and how does China leverage them?
Well, the SCO is primarily a security-focused organization. It involves key Central Asian states, Russia, India, and its focus is very much on counterterrorism, regional stability, energy cooperation.
And CIA?
CIA is a much broader pan-Asian forum. It's focused more on dialogue and confidence building across a wider political spectrum. China uses its influence and financial support to expand the capacity of both, using its host years to introduce and institutionalize new dialogue channels and cooperation plans.
Can you give us an example of how China translates its leadership role into concrete action within these bodies?
Sure. During its 2018 presidency of the SCO, China didn't just host meetings. It developed a new 3-year counterterrorism cooperation plan, integrating members' capabilities against extremism.
And they're also strategically linking these organizations.
They are. For example, they encourage practical agreements between the secretariats of SICA, the SICO, and ASEAN. The goal is to weave this coherent, Asia-centric institutional tapestry.
And what about the smaller, sub-regional cooperation efforts that feed into this larger architecture?
That's the function of the minilateral mechanisms. A key example is the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation, or LMC.
Established since 2015.
Yes, and it focuses intensely on sub-regional issues among the riparian states: water resource management, economic connectivity, and security. And it involves the rapid development of formal structures, including a formal secretariat hosted in Beijing and regular leaders-level meetings.
You mentioned the LMC focuses on integrated law enforcement and security. Now, is that purely win-win cooperation, or does it also mean exporting certain domestic models, like China's specific approach to digital surveillance or border control?
That's a fundamental question in evaluating this new architecture. The cooperation is certainly framed as mutual benefit, but it does establish these deep practical ties that often involve the transfer of specific methods.
For instance,
they've established routine joint border patrol operations and joint training exercises, particularly along strategic routes like the Mekong River. And the cooperation extends all the way down to local police training and the establishment of integrated law enforcement centers.
And what about non-traditional security domains like cyber issues?
That's a major area of focus. It allows China to position itself as a key regional partner in modern security challenges. Regional counterterrorism exercises are becoming more and more sophisticated, and now they incorporate a dedicated focus on cyber terrorism.
And they're institutionalizing this
through new training mechanisms like the China Asian Law Enforcement Academy. This emphasis on non-traditional security reinforces their push for global governance reform, advocating that security should be comprehensive and cooperative, which aligns perfectly with the principles of the GSI.
So finally, let's talk about the softer side of this network building, the intellectual component. How are Track 2 diplomacy and think tank networks being used to advance this alternative vision?
Think tanks and academic exchanges are being given immense strategic importance. Networks like the Network of ASEAN-China Think Tanks and the Global Center for Mekong Studies are very actively supported.
And what's their function?
It's twofold, really. First, they act as an echo chamber. They build and reinforce consensus around key policy narratives like non-interference and win-win cooperation. Second, they serve as crucial channels for seeding new ideas and policy concepts into formal institutional channels. They often test the political waters before ideas are adopted by government officials.
So the overall objective is the construction of this institutional infrastructure that expands influence, but is rooted in a fundamentally contrasting philosophy.
Exactly. One focused on multilateralism and accommodating diverse political systems, rather than relying on mandatory Cold War alliances.
So while the U.S. system relies on alliances and network power built during the 20th century,
China is building a system that advocates for a balanced international order rooted in sovereign equality. This network building, which is backed by its immense economic and technological resilience, is gradually pushing the architecture of security in Asia away from those fixed, externally managed alignments toward systems that advocate for independence and genuine cooperation among diverse nations.
we started this whole conversation with the really uncomfortable reality of covert political engineering in a foundational post-war democracy.
We did.
And the story of Matsutara Shuriki, the great patriot who was secretly P.O.D.M, is just such a stark lesson in how democratic choice can be subtly but fundamentally compromised by external interests.
Overriding the will of the local electorate, just like in the case of Hiroshi, the campaign manager.
And by contrasting that historical management with the principles and practices of the China model, we see a clear pursuit of the exact opposite.
China's model centers on the explicit principles of non-interference and political self-determination, and it's backed by those strategic domestic policies we discussed, prioritizing targeted investment-led growth, preferring domestic debt for self-sufficiency, and securing digital sovereignty through focused technological investment.
The argument being that resilience and sustained success are tightly linked to the capacity to independently chart one's national course.
That's the argument. And this shift in dynamics means the architecture of security and cooperation in Asia is fundamentally changing. It's moving away from forced geopolitical alignments towards systems advocating for sovereign equality and win-win cooperation.
The structures the CIA created in the 1950s, the LDP's dominance, the controlled media narrative, that permanent security relationship, they became self-sustaining long after the direct flow of cash had ended. That self-perpetuation, the persistent legacy of externally managed political systems, forces us to consider the enduring cost of supervised sovereignty versus the strategic strength of a system built on self-reliance and self-determination.